One of the greatest obstacles to crafting health and wellness is identifying and controlling inflammation. It's at the core of all complex and chronic diseases, and it's the driving mechanism that underlies the most common symptoms that people like you struggle to overcome. Join us as we explore cutting-edge science and research to give you the information and tools you need to create the quality of life you want and deserve. And now, here is the host of Inflammation Nation, Dr. Stephen Noseworthy.
Hey there, and welcome back to the Inflammation Nation. I'm Dr. Noseworthy, and we're talking about hormones. We've been talking about cortisol particularly, and in the last episode, we talked about how cortisol has an impact on energy modulation, brain function, and sleep throughout the day. And we talked about how high cortisol and low cortisol can result in different symptoms at different times of the day. And you can kind of use that framework or use that concept as a framework to get a general idea of what a salivary cortisol index test might show you. And I want to point out again that that's not, just going by symptoms is not diagnostic. And as a general rule, I don't like to use symptoms as the only way for me to figure out what's going on with one of my clients. Ideally, you want objective data. There are some places where symptoms can be primary drivers or determinants of what you're dealing with. But as a general rule, symptoms alone are, not the greatest guide, but it's a loose approximation. I want to move on now, and I want to talk about the impact of cortisol on other systems. And we're going to start with the thyroid. And I think what I need to do is really kind of map out in general how the thyroid system works, and then explain to you how cortisol has an impact on that. And so this is really still more of a cortisol discussion, even though there's going to be a fair amount of information that I'll share with you in today's episode about the thyroid system. Eventually, we'll do a more in-depth dive into the thyroid, just because it's so common for thyroid disorders, particularly Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, the autoimmune variant of that, which is the most common cause of low thyroid. And it's a big part of my practice. It's not exclusively what I deal with, but certainly a large percentage of my clientele have autoimmune thyroid issues, plus many other things, including changes in cortisol. And, for me as a clinician, it's important to be able to understand, find, rectify, and communicate the concepts that I'm going to share with you today, because a lot of my clients that have autoimmune thyroid issues also have cortisol dysregulation to one degree or another. And it's just part of the bigger picture. And if I, as a clinician, can't find that and can't help guide changes in diet, lifestyle, or supplementation to account for it, if I can't figure out what's driving the cortisol dysfunction, it's going to be hard for me to resolve the unresolved thyroid symptoms that someone wants me to help them with. And that's kind of a rambling introduction, but there you have it. That's what it is. So let's talk about the thyroid system. There's probably many different ways that you can characterize the thyroid system. But the first thing I would say to you is it is a system. It's called the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, just like the cortisol system is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so up in the brain, you have this collection of neurons in the hypothalamus and the pituitary that govern your adrenal system, your thyroid system, as well as your gonadal system. So anything that starts with HP, hypothalamic pituitary, and then something, is part of this system. And you could really say that the adrenal system, the thyroid system, and the reproductive system, or the gonadal system, are just three different divisions or three different aspects or three different facets of the same thing, which is how your brain controls major hormonal communication systems and pathways. And so with the HPT, or hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, by looking at the system as a whole, we avoid the trap of thinking that it's just about my thyroid gland. And if I'm not making hormones, all I have to do is just take thyroid hormones and I'll be good. And of course, thyroid hormone replacement is quite often a necessary part of managing these HPT axis disruptions, most of which are autoimmune. But it's very, very important to be able to see that big picture and not just get sucked into a glandular focus. That's probably the most important thing to start with. And like I said, there's any number of different ways that you can slice and dice the thyroid system to talk about it in a rational way. But I find it most beneficial and productive And this is what I do with my own clients. It's how I teach it in functional medicine seminars. But I find it most productive to divide the system into 3 different functional sections. And in my love of alliteration, I break it down into production, processing, and what's called proteomics, which is just basically protein production. And so, again, zooming out, going big picture, seeing the entire system, we can talk about the production side, how we make thyroid hormones. We can talk about the processing aspect, which is how our body basically processes and converts hormones into active or inactive versions. There's a couple of other elements to that. And then the final portion of this is the proteomic side, which is once thyroid hormones stimulate a cell by going into the nucleus and binding to the thyroid receptors, essentially it hits the on button for the metabolic machinery, which causes the cell to do the things it's designed to do and produce the things that it's designed to produce, whether that might be muscle tissue or fat tissue or bone tissue or brain tissue. It doesn't really matter. Proteomics is the name that we use for protein production at the cellular level, or this process of making things from a cellular mechanism. And so production is pretty simple. When the hypothalamus talks to the pituitary, which then talks to the thyroid gland, we make thyroid hormones, assuming that all things are equal. Now, with Hashimoto's hypothyroidism, the most common cause of low thyroid or primary thyroid disorders and diseases, what ends up happening is you have an autoimmune response to parts of that production machinery, if you will. And there are specific antibodies that we find with Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. Those are antibodies to TPO or thyroid peroxidase, as well as antibodies to what's called thyroglobulin. So we see anti-thyroglobulin antibodies. And it doesn't really matter which one of those is the target. Sometimes it's both. But ultimately, at the end, what happens is with a production problem, most of which is Hashimoto's, we end up with reduced thyroid hormone production. We have less T3 and less T4 that's being manufactured. And so the role of cortisol here is not in the thyroid gland in the sense of cortisol disrupts how the gland itself puts these hormones together. The problem is higher in the system. It's actually up in the brain, where excess cortisol can inhibit the role and the function of the hypothalamus and the pituitary as it issues commands to the thyroid gland to produce. And so cortisol, excess cortisol in particular, will inhibit the communication signals that come from the brain that says, hey, thyroid gland, I want you to make some more T4 and some more T3. And so clinically, the outcome of that is typically a suppression. And I'm going to just talk a little bit about laboratory markers here and hormones. With high cortisol states that inhibit this production process, we end up with a low TSH output, and we end up with low T4. And that's kind of a natural consequence because that's how the system is designed. The pituitary gland makes TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. That goes and binds to receptors in the thyroid gland, which then causes the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones. So if TSH coming out of the brain is low, then the signal or the instructions to make thyroid hormones is weak, and we make less hormones. So anything that suppresses TSH, anything that suppresses the hypothalamus or the pituitary in that role will by necessity translate into some degree of lower thyroid hormones being produced. And so aspect number one of cortisol as it relates to thyroid hormones is that it squashes hormone production, T3 and T4 specifically. But production is only one aspect. And by the way, this is a very top-level view. There's a lot more that could be said about thyroid hormone production. There are other patterns of production problems, primary, secondary, and so on. We're not going to get into that because most of the things that we deal with in terms of production capacity, it does relate to Hashimoto's. But then we have this extra factor that a lot of people with hypothyroidism and Hashimoto's disease have adrenal dysfunction, and if they so happen to have high cortisol production, it will tend to inhibit the production process even further. And so you can see that that will complicate the scenario. Hi there, it's Dr. Noseworthy. I want to extend my appreciation to all of you in the Inflammation Nation who have helped my podcast become a great success in these first few months. I truly appreciate you. Also wanted to let you know about my brand new do-it-yourself online program called the 5-Step Gut Protocol. I designed this program for people who want to take charge of their own health and stop waiting around for someone else to tell them what to do. I've combined old naturopathic principles with cutting-edge research to create a truly unique program that will help you construct your own gut protocol. If you've ever wondered if you have gut infections, a leaky gut, or a bad microbiome, then this program will walk you through the steps to figure that out and gives you the tools that you need to formulate a practical strategy to help make things better. I guarantee at the end of this course you'll know more about your gut than your doctor does, and you will feel confident that you know how to address your unique situation. You can check it out at my website at www.drnoseworthy.com. That's drnoseworthy.com. And just look for the tab at the top that says The Programs. Thanks for listening. Now, in terms of the second facet or the second aspect of thyroid systems, the next one is what happens to the hormones once they enter circulation. Because once the gland makes, let's say T4, which is most of what the thyroid gland makes, T4 is not biologically active to any great extent. And so we have to have some way to convert T4 into T3, which is the active hormone that works at the cellular level to drive proteomic responses or protein production. And most of that happens in the liver. There's a family of enzymes, not to get too complicated, but there's a family of enzymes called deiodinases. And there's 3 different ones. There's D1, D2, and D3 that do different things depending on what the outcome needs to be. But when we have excess cortisol, the conversion of T4 into T3, which is the active form, gets skewed in some way. And there's more than one option here, but in general, when we look at the conversion of T4 into T3 and the role that cortisol might play in affecting that, is that it tends to shift or downregulate the production or the conversion of T4 into T3. So we end up with more inactive hormones and less active hormones. Because remember, we make mostly T4. The production process makes mostly T4, but we have to convert that into T3 for our cells to use it. Cortisol tends to inhibit that. So with excess cortisol and stress responses, we're going to have less T3 coming out of that conversion process. But to add insult to injury, it also tends to divert some of that T4 hormone that we start with into an analog of T3 called reverse T3. So from T4, we get less T3 being produced, the active hormone, and we can also get more reverse T3 being produced. Now, when I teach these concepts in my doctor seminars, I tend to characterize reverse T3 as the evil twin of T3, because really all it is, it's a T3 molecule that's kind of been turned around inside out, so to speak. And the net result of converting into reverse T3 is that it can bind to the same receptors at the cell level that T3 does, but it doesn't activate the cells to the same extent. In fact, we have some research that shows that if we produce more reverse T3 and less T3, we can reduce cellular activation by as much as about 33%. Let's call it a third, which is a lot. Nobody wants to walk around with a 33% reduction in thyroid activity. That would lead to all kinds of problems and all kinds of symptoms. But again, going back to the role that cortisol plays, is that these enzymes that are responsible for taking the T4 that comes out of the production side and converting it from the inactive to the active form can either do that job really well or not. And cortisol has such an influence that it dysregulates the conversion process. Now, are there other processing issues? Absolutely. There are processing issues that have to do with elevations in estrogen or testosterone. That's more complicated than I want to get into with this discussion, because I'd rather keep it just centered around the impact of cortisol. So suffice it to say at this point, excess cortisol and stress chemistry can downregulate the production of thyroid hormones and change how your body processes those And it changes the relative proportion of active and inactive T3 hormones that act at the cell to drive your proteomic responses. And in fact, before we move on to the proteomic side, the balance between your free T3 and your reverse T3 is absolutely critical to have normal proteomic responses. And so you can imagine that stress chemistry in reducing T3 and increasing reverse T3 can worsen the scenario or worsen the tug of war that happens between those two hormones that ultimately determines, are your cells going to be active or are they not? And that's really is what it's at stake. At stake is the extent to which your hormone balance, your thyroid hormone balance, gives you the probability of good cellular function or bad cellular function, or let's say less efficient cellular function. So that's production and that's processing. And listen, I'm screaming through these concepts because I'm trying to keep it down to just a single episode here. But I teach this stuff for like 3 days at a time. So there's a lot that can be said about thyroid physiology, how the system works, and then tying that into other systems like cortisol. So this is really just kind of a taste of a much more complex scenario. And then finally, we have the third arm or aspect of the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid system, and that is the proteomic response. Like, how does the cell actually respond to the hormones that are being presented to it? And what we know is that excess cortisol not only inhibits production, not only will it dysregulate the conversion of T4 into either active or inactive hormones. We also know that stress chemistry can interfere with how the cell responds to the hormones that are there. So let's assume for the moment that you have normal production. There's nothing interfering with how much T4 that you're making that comes out of the thyroid gland, so production is good. And let's assume for the moment that you have nothing that's interfering with the processing aspect, that you're able to take your inactive T4 coming out of production and processing that to convert it into an active hormone that's in balance and capable of giving you a good cellular response. But let's say that your stress chemistry is actually interfering with the receptor sites in your cells, so that even though you have normal hormones available, you don't get the cellular response because something's jamming the signal, to use a simple analogy. And that's really what cortisol and other things like inflammatory responses can do, is that it can change how your cells respond to your hormones, even though your hormones are adequate. And I will tell you that this is a very common problem that tends to mystify doctors that are working, particularly if they're conventionally trained and their perspective is extremely narrow when it comes to the thyroid gland and hormone replacement. But it is very common for me to work with people, mostly women, who do have Hashimoto's hypothyroidism. They do have stress chemistry problems, and they have a normal amount of hormones, mostly because they're taking thyroid hormones in a pill form. They don't really have many things that are interfering with processing, but when we ask the question, are we getting the results at the cell that we're expecting to get based on their hormonal environment, the answer is no. And so the only way that can, be a real issue or a real problem when production and processing are okay is that we're changing the proteomic expression. We're interfering with how the cell responds to the influence of the hormones that are already there. This is what we call a thyroid resistance pattern. It's a lack of proteomic expression, but it's a thyroid resistance. The hormones are there, but the receptors don't work, so the cell doesn't get the response. And it's no different than having something like insulin resistance. And I know that I've talked about insulin resistance in many episodes, and just even earlier when we talked about cortisol's influence over things like blood sugar control. Insulin resistance is a situation where when insulin gets too high, the insulin receptors become less sensitive, they become more resistant, and then the action of insulin doesn't work. And so you need more insulin to accomplish the same goal. And that's a kind of a self-perpetuating problem. And again, we see similar problems with thyroid resistance, where it may not necessarily be an excess of thyroid hormones causing the problem, but there are other things, what we call homotropic heterotropic modulators, things outside of the system that are affecting the system. Cortisol is a big one, inflammatory chemicals are another. And what they do in essence, just to repeat and make sure I'm being clear, is that they interfere with how the receptors for thyroid hormones respond to even adequate amounts and balance of thyroid hormones. So to kind of back up again and just to summarize before we close out this particular discussion, is that the impact of cortisol elevations and stress chemistry in general on the thyroid system is profound. And if we categorize or if we subdivide the thyroid system into three main functional categories, and we talk about the production side of things, we talk about the processing side of things, and we talk about the proteomic or cellular responses, the potential for stress, chemistry, and adrenal dysfunction to impair any or all of those three different aspects of the thyroid system is very real, and it's very, very common, which is why it's not automatic, but it's very common for me in my initial evaluation of clients with thyroid issues to also assess their circadian rhythm, their cortisol production. We want to make sure that we understand what are the main players, and is cortisol involved in dysregulating either production, processing, or proteomics. Just another reason why getting a handle on what your cortisol production, your circadian rhythm is, so you can gauge its impact on how other systems are involved. Even if stress chemistry and circadian rhythm abnormalities are not your primary concern, it's such a profound player and has so much potential impact on your thyroid that we're almost obligated to ask the question, is it a problem? And if so, how do we assess it? How do we understand it? I know that was a big brainful today, breaking thyroid down into three functional categories, and then talking about cortisol's impact, but basically it's from stem to stern, it's from top to bottom, it's from the inside out. High cortisol and stress chemistry can impair any aspect of how the thyroid system is functioning. Thank you so much for listening to the Inflammation Nation. If you found this episode valuable, please rate, review, and subscribe to our podcast. Be the first to know when a new episode drops so that you can stay on top of your game. It also helps others like you find the answers they need. And why not head over to my main website, drnoseworthy.com, that's drnoseworthy.com, to explore my personalized functional medicine coaching programs, submit a question to the podcast, maybe take a quiz, or even reach out to me using the contact form that you can find there. We'll see you next time.